I would like to first start off by saying thank you for having me and welcome. I believe it was Tennyson who said, "Those who stay at home and wait also serve." And I think it's something we all need to remember. My home was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and we lived in if you've been back east, you know that there are, we call them condos out here, but they were row houses, and they had a common wall. Ours did. It was 3 stories tall and about 12, perhaps 15 feet wide, and I have no idea how long, but lengthy. It had 1 bath and an outhouse that frankly we didn't use very often, but it did exist. Coal was for heat and for cooking, and there was a small a gas stove as well, and we had a refrigerator and an ice box. Now, you have such things in your houses sometimes these days, but in those days there actually was an ice box. And you put a card in the window, and a fellow came by and saw the number that was right side up. He just cut out a piece, put it over his shoulder, brought it into your house, just walked in. We had locks, but anyhow, and took the old piece out, put it down below, emptied the water, and put the new piece in. And that's how you got your ice in your ice box. And as I said, we did have a small refrigerator as well. These were with my grandparents, my grandmother and grandfather. My grandfather died in 1944. I miss him to this very day. I truly do. One of his in-laws said that he was a saint. I would not argue that. We did not have a victory garden. There simply wasn't any room for it. That's all there was to it. And I did get a chance to visit it some years ago, and it's still as small as it was when I was a kid. No doubt about it. My mother worked at Indiantown Gap Military Reservation. I assume as some kind of a stenographer, typist, whatever. My dad was in the slammer, and I hope that you'll perhaps ask about that situation when we get to the Q&A period. My grandmother was a homemaker, and she did a lot of canning and cooking and so on. But I think I could honestly say that today she would be an early practitioner of tough love. She was hell on wheels sometimes. Well, anyhow, my grandfather worked in the steel mill, and he was a gentle soul. He and I never had difficulty at all, although Grandma was a disciplinarian for their family. They had 7 children, and of course, 4 me. We rent a cottage in the summer, and we had to take the bus to cross the river and then walk a very long way when we got off. They didn't ever have a car. So far as I know, they never owned a car in their entire lives. They just got around by bus or walked. For me, I worked as a kid, about age 8, which would have made it 1943. I had a newspaper route, and we did our own collecting, not like they do today. And you had a little card with a punch, and if the people gave you the money, you punched it, and if they didn't, and usually said, "Come back next week," you had no choice but to do that. And the only thing that really mattered was that you got enough money to be able to pay for the papers that you delivered that week, and if there was anything left over, that was, quote, profit, unquote. My other duties around the house was that I helped shovel coal for the furnace, and to chop up wood to start the fire, both in the furnace and in the wood stove that we also had. School, we of course did the salute to the flag. Today, of course, we put our hand over our heart and that sort of thing. In my day, in the beginning of the war anyway, we put our hand over our heart and said, "I pledge allegiance to the flag." And that was quickly ruled out as it was somewhat reminder of the fascist salute, and of course was done away with. We bought stamps, victory stamps, if you will. They were in little books, kind of like the green stamps that we get today. We bought a 25-cent one every week, and believe me when I tell you that if you didn't buy yours, the whole school knew about it in no time at all. They really did. It's just one of the things I'd like to find out someday is just how many of those things were actually ever redeemed. Because if you didn't fill out the whole book, which was worth $18.75 for a $25 war bond, Unless it was full, it had no value at all. As I said, it'd be interesting to see how much was never redeemed. In any case, I can remember we had a teacher, her name was Muma, I can remember vividly. She was the devil's grandmother, she must have been. She made us do those math tables upside down, backwards, and all of that sort of stuff to the point of where we almost couldn't deal with it anymore. But we had a certain of a saving grace. She had a scar from here to here, probably a thyroid or God only knows what, but we were all convinced that some kid just couldn't take it anymore and tried to do the old girl in, you know. Another teacher, we made cottage cheese. You have no idea how many decades I went before I had cheese again. It was just gross, and that was on its best day. It was bad, anyhow. But we did such things as on the playgrounds, we chased each other around and played tag, and all those neat things you're not allowed to do anymore. 'Tis a pity. Kids will be kids, you know, but anyhow. We also played cowboys and Indians when we weren't at school, and of course everybody wanted to be a cowboy naturally. There were no war games. We just played cowboys and Indians endlessly and so on. We really did. It was a lot of fun, but again, we were young. I was born in 1935. The war started in 1941, so I was 6 years old. So I was still quite young, but nevertheless, certainly in that sense, a little bit aware. We had toys, naturally. Nothing like you see today, of course. Many of them surrounded or associated with the war itself. We had a machine gun that had a kind of a clicker on it and went tat, 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 and as you cranked it, and it sounded like it was putting out the real thing. And we also had a target thing. It was bombardier, and you had a thing you looked into, and it had a mirror, and it looked down onto a mat on the floor, and you had darts. And when you were ready to bomb a Japanese or a German war factory or whatever, you pulled a little thing, the dart came down, and if you hit, you got so many points, and it worked great. Cowboy cap pistols were quite common, and of course, with the cowboys and Indians, you know, whatever. In my free time, I knocked around a lot. We went down the street to a carpet cleaner, and you could look in the bottom into the basement, and here was a guy who would drag out a carpet and put it on a kind of a raised thing, maybe 6 inches high, with a kind of a gutter all the way around it. He'd throw out this rug, throw soap on it, take one of those machines they use to buff with, to shine the floors these days, you know, they're about so big around, you know, and all that, and that was used to scrub it like mad. He hosed it down, took a squeegee, and when he was all done, he rolled it back up, took it somewhere else, brought another one. We watched them forever. There was a beer distributor not far away. No, they didn't make any, they distributed, but they had these long sets of rollers. And these guys would roll cases of beer down this darn thing for 20, 30 feet, maybe even more, and they never came off. And I never figured out how they really managed to kind of get the windage on them and so on. But we watched them roll those things out and put them in the trucks, of course, take them to wherever they were going and so on. Harrisburg is the capital of Pennsylvania. And fortunately, we had a lot of museums that were free. And that wasn't all that far from our home. I don't know, 6, 8 blocks perhaps, something like that. And we would go down there. Often I went alone. It was safe in those days. Went alone. I went into museums and saw that George Washington slept here or went potty here or whatever he did, you know, that sort of thing. There were movies on weekends, mostly on Saturdays, which were always, you got a whole thing. You got a news, you got a cartoon, you got a serial, you got a grade B movie, you got a grade B plus movie maybe, that sort of thing. But you got a whole afternoon for 11 cents. For kids, of course, whatever. I did some fishing. My grandpa and I did a lot of fishing when we were at the cottage. And also there was a lake not too far away, and we could take the bus and go there. As far as the government was concerned, everything, of course, was surrounded, if you will, associated with the war. And everything seemed to be military. I even got to the point of where where it said, you know, on a watch or whatever, made in the USA, I was absolutely convinced it meant made in the United States Army. Just the way it was. Did not really understand what was going on and what was really it was all about, but I knew that the Germans and the Japanese were the bad guys. Our films showed that, obviously. The radios mentioned it, all of the advertising, obviously the posters and so on. Everything was portrayed everywhere that way. And I do not really recall much about the Italians. Somehow or other, they were not the object of abuse, if you will, that the Germans and the Japanese were. And I don't want to get into that. I have some thoughts on it, but nevertheless, they were considered to be, they were not really part of the big picture as far as the population seemed to be concerned. And I do not ever recall, my granddad would come home from work and bury his ear in the radio for about an hour and listen to what was happening and so on. He had 2 sons in the military. But I don't remember ever hearing, I don't remember ever talking to him about what it was all about. Just what was happening around me, and you were kind of picking it up and that kind of thing. And I'm not sure, even at my age, I would have understood much about it anyway, to be honest. There, of course, was the Civilian Defense Corps, if you will, who had their little hats and their armbands. And we were in Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. Now, from the New Jersey coast, that had to be 125, 150 miles as the crow flies. Now, I subsequently found out, of course, that the Germans did never produce an aircraft carrier. And they certainly couldn't shell us from the beach from there, but we nevertheless, they walked by, and if there was even the slightest crack, you got this knock on the door, and by God, you fixed that thing no matter what, and so on. They also had a storefront thing, the civilian defense, of bingo once a week, and you won food, beans, rice, pasta, that sort of thing. My grandma loved it. As far as the soldiers were concerned, of course, it's the old Rudyard Kipling kind of mentality. In war, soldiers can do no wrong. In peace, that's quite another story, needless to say. We see them as quite something very, very different. My Uncle Del was in the Navy, my grandparents did not appreciate, especially my grandma, his remarks that he was a machinist mate, so he was down in the engine room, and that he was, if anything happened to the ship, he was on the Tuscaloosa heavy cruiser, that he would be the first one to Davy Jones's locker. She didn't appreciate that at all. He also brought home a .50 caliber round one time. We took the shell out and dumped all the powder in the toilet. I can remember that vividly, but it was, well, about that long. And it was, again, one of the things that was used on, in the guns, or on the guns, if you will, on the ship itself. My Aunt Catherine was married to a captain in the Signal Corps. And he brought home a crystal set one time, and they were fascinating. You know, they had the little things you can move around and actually pick up stuff, you know, and so on. He also brought home a Colt automatic, semi-automatic pistol, a 1911 job. And this thing, of course, I remember I'm 8 years old, you know, whatever. This thing looked like it was a howitzer, okay? But I was absolutely fascinated by it, and I have had a lifelong fascination and interest in firearms ever since. My Uncle Charles worked for Martin Bomber, which was in Maryland, and just outside of Baltimore. And as I said, my dad was in the Slammer, and again, I hope you'll ask me about that. There were the window banners, which you have there in the corner. My Uncle Ken was in the 82nd Airborne, which would have gone into Normandy, but he had broken his leg, and he had a family, and so then was in communications, and they left him back in the States. They never did get to Europe when they went to go over and eventually get involved at Normandy and the invasion. And I think it's safe to say that most kids really did want to emulate their uncles and whatever, the soldiers, not so much the uniforms as such, but just for what they were doing, you know, that sort of thing. Contributions to the war effort, everybody was involved. They really were. We collected fats and turned those in to get extra stamps, which we could then turn into buying food. Foil, around gum wrappers and cigarettes and toothpaste, which were not made of plastic toothpaste tubes in those days. They were made of a kind of an alloy of lead, and when you folded them, they stayed folded. Okay, that stuff didn't ever go back in, and like we see today. And we could turn that in as well. I found out later, what they did was they chopped it up and made confetti out of it, really, what we today call chaff. And it was used to dump out the side of the airplanes and so on when bombers and so on were making a raid, and it drove the enemy radar out of its mind. It looked like a snowstorm. Okay, and this was turned in, as I said, and so on. Today we spend a fortune to buy it. Cans, metals, everything was recycled in one form or another, and so on, and reused or whatever. There was rationing. Everybody had a stamp book, kids, adults, so on. And we had meatless Tuesdays and Fridays, 2 days a week. Actually, I never realized that there was a meat shortage and all of that sort of thing, because as you may have read in your material, the innards were not rationed. And so my grandmother made all kinds of interesting stuff. Stuffed beef heart, use the same thing that you use for your turkeys and so on, but you fill a beef heart with that and bake it. Liver. My granddad, every Sunday he made a fire. He had a fire. We had a wood stove, and got it good and hot. Cleaned it, made it good and hot, and that liver would go on and go, psh, and then he would turn it over very quickly, and it would do it again, and you got it, and it was still nice and juicy, and a little bit of the blood coming out, but it was delicious. Okay, whatever. Kidneys were made with potatoes and a thickening and so on, kind of like a stew. Chicken gizzards. Chickens were also not rationed, and we used to buy them at the farmer's market not far away. And on the weekends, the people from Lancaster County, the Pennsylvania Dutch, would come in, and we would buy a chicken or two and keep them in the cellar. And eventually, when it came time for them to go to the Happy Chicken Honey Ground, we took care of them, whatever. My grandmother had a special cauldron for those chickens. It was enough to feed the entire Chinese army, I think, whatever. I'm serious. And she made noodles out of it. She just made the dough and made in big squares, I don't know, 2-3 inches square, something like that. They weren't dumplings. They were actually noodles. And she threw this chicken in there and just cooked the hell out of it, okay, until it was literally, eventually it was nothing but grounds at the bottom of the thing, whatever, and just kept adding water. Of course, in those days, they didn't know it, or they didn't understand that the chicken broth is very good, and it's not the fat that gives it the flavor. In those days, that's what everybody thought. That fat on the top was yummy, and all of that, and that's what you wanted, and yeah, okay. As I said, she kept adding water to it until it was all gone, and then she started again. You salvaged and recycled everything, and what you could not salvage and recycle, you repaired. And today we have a throwaway society, not in World War II. You repaired everything if you possibly could. Entertainment, the movies, as I told you that before. War bonds, of course, were always in between the shows. They would send around a can, and you would donate for war bonds, for the war effort. Of course, lots of propaganda, obviously radio, and so on. And music. Kate Smith. If you haven't heard her sing God Bless America, you haven't lived. I'm sorry, but it's true. Okay, it really is. And of course, with the Andrews sisters, a lot of it very, very romantic, and that sort of thing. And it was a different kind of time.
My name is Pat Magruder. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, and that's where I spent the war years. I'm a little older than Chuck, so I spent most of my high school years during the war. But I was the first one in my family to realize that we had really gone to war. I knew my father was a real student of history, and so he had explained a lot to me when the Germans attacked Poland in 1939, but we didn't seem to be too involved in it at that time. But I went to a small parochial school with nuns, And we had a saying, I mean, it's something that's been going around for years about the good nuns, but I went to school with the Sisters of Little or No Mercy. Actually, they were the Sisters of Mercy, but we weren't sure. But anyway, because of that, on Sunday, I was at a meeting for what they called the mission societies. And I was coming home on the streetcar, and I had to transfer streetcars. That's when we had public transportation. And they had headlines. That's when papers came out and you had that was the fastest means of communication. The headlines were the first thing that you saw. You didn't hear it on the radio necessarily, but it said, Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Well, I went home and I told my father, and he immediately turned on the radio and explained to me exactly what the attack on Pearl Harbor meant. As Linda said, my father was an air raid warden, and of course we lived in Denver, which is quite a ways from any beach, or any aircraft carrier, any bombers that can get any place. But so there was a lady in our neighborhood, she was an elderly lady, and she just refused to black out her windows. My father would talk to her and she says, if those dumb Japanese can get over the Rocky Mountains, they can have me, I don't care. So she just never did pull her drapes. One of the things that we all did was, or one of the things that all the girls in our high school just thought was great, was because of the war, they were rationing fabric and things like that. And before that, all the schools had to wear uniforms. But we did not have to wear the uniform. And that eventually got to the point where it annoyed the nuns a little bit because the skirts got exponentially short as the war went on. Finally, it ended, and I think they were glad to get rid of all of us in our short skirts. Then we also decided, they said, we got to knit these little squares. I never understood what squares were for, but my knitting was really not very good. I'd start out and it would be about like this, and it would grow till I had a pyramid, only upside down. It just never quite worked, so I decided they better forget that about me. In 1943, I went to work for the Denver Public Library, which was quite an experience at that time because I was a runner, what they called a runner or a page. You just went chasing after the books that everybody wanted. And it was not blacked out. We were open until 9 o'clock in the evening, and they never turned the lights out on that. So I figured if they don't black out the library, I guess we can leave our windows open too. Then some of the most popular books at that time were the books that were coming out at that time that it was telling about the war. There were war stories. There were books about the Doolittle Raid. There were books about Germans, particularly the rise of Nazism, fascism in Italy. There were even some books about the Russians at the time. But the most popular books for all of us who worked in the library were in the 612 division, which happens to be the sex division. We were all anxious to learn about sex, and particularly if you went to a parochial school, you just didn't know anything about sex. So we did that, and then it was the summer of before my senior year, the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. We didn't realize how important that was at the time because nobody really knew the strength of the atomic bomb. We didn't even know what the bomb was. But then it was on the 15th of August that the war ended. But one of the biggest things that happened in my senior year in school was when I went to take my chemistry class, was the nun who taught that class said, I don't know that I can teach this class anymore because of what had happened. The atomic bomb changed all the science at the time. It changed physics and it changed chemistry. And it changed some of the math because it was something that was well, it was unheard of. So that was why they felt like they needed somebody new to start teaching, and they had to find somebody. And we never did find anybody when I was a senior. I was never that good at it anyway. I worked at the public library all that time. Then when I got out of the high school, I went to the University of Denver. The University of Denver in 1946, like all the other colleges, was the year that all the veterans were returning. And there's an old saying in World War I that came out that says, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? Well, after World War II, you didn't keep any of them at home. They came from New York to go to the University of Denver. They came from Chicago. They came from all over. And people from Denver went to places like Philadelphia and Harvard and things like this. And this was mostly due, and this was one of the most important things that came out of World War II, was what the Congress and the President did for the veterans coming out. It established the GI Bill, which allowed them to go to school. And they really were thankful. They treated their veterans well. They got the loans for their housing, which I was fortunate enough to have married a vet who could do that. We had all of that, and also everybody started to move around a lot. These are the things that were really the result, and the good results that happened after the war. I think nowadays we really don't appreciate what our veterans do for us. I'm a little prejudiced because my husband died last year. He was a veteran of the Iwo Jima campaign. And despite all the things that happened on that, he survived that. And all of us did survive a lot of our vices. Believe it or not, it was all right to smoke then. As a matter of fact, it was the glamorous thing to do. And like Chuck said, we would save the foil from all the cigarette wrappings. We also did have rationing. And I remember one of the things I had to do was get my shoes half soled. Now, I don't know whether you understand what that means, but you have your shoes and the soles of them wear out, and then they have these little things that you glue on. Sometimes the glues didn't stick, and they would flop a lot, which was not good when you're in Denver in the snow. Then my father sold his car at the beginning of the war because he knew that there was gas rationing and tire rationing, and it just seemed like there was no reason to keep the car. So we either walked, we took public transportation, or usually in our area, they had one person in the neighborhood who kept a car, and everybody carpooled when it was essential. But we could take public transportation almost any place, and we didn't mind doing it. I guess what you don't have, you never miss. We had we had the Lowry Air Base, we had Buckley Air Base, we had Fort Logan, and we had Fitzsimmons General Hospital. And we did go out and visit the veterans out there, or the wounded, and some of the psychiatric patients. And that was before they really knew what we now call PST. So, but we were visited with them, and also surprisingly, while we were there, they had beautiful grounds at the hospital, and those grounds were all maintained by Italian prisoners of war. And I did go to the USO. We had the USO. I did go. We had a few dances with the troops. My mother and father both worked at the USO. They served dinners on Sunday night. And of course, they usually volunteered me to clean up the dishes, which was, I don't know, kids just naturally get the dish routine. So, but I think that's about it.
Good evening. I'm Joan Klinke, and Ray started his service in January of 43, and I joined him in July 44 in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I moved to 8 different places. I would get my rooms mostly through the USO. And he would, in the evening after dinner, I would go to visit him at his base. And on Saturdays, he would have free until Sunday late afternoon. He received $75 a month, and I did not get any allotment. So I tried to get jobs at the different places that I visited or was with him. And when I wasn't working, I would have dinner with some of the other cadets' wives. In July, he was sent overseas, so I had to go back to Illinois. And my sister and I tried to find an apartment. But because we were not defense workers, or our husbands were not defense workers, even though they were both overseas, we had to go and live with my parents. On September 28th, the day I came home from the hospital with a baby, he was shot down. I started to wonder because I didn't get any letters from him. And at the end of October, I got a telegram saying that he was missing in action. Because he was the pilot and the oldest person on the crew, the mothers of the other crew members would call me to see if I knew something that they didn't know, which I never did. I would go into Chicago to Red Cross meetings, and they would show me or tell us how and what to mail. And so the packages would be about so big, and I would fill them with everything under the sun. If there was any space left over, I would open cans of beef bouillon cubes and throw them into the... Now, I got ahead of myself. No, I didn't. At the end of December, I received a letter that a card from him with his name on it, with a check that he was not wounded. That is when I started to go to the Red Cross meetings. He returned back in May, and I rented a cottage by a lake because he only weighed 90 pounds, and so he would put on some weight and before he would start into the real world. We had to go and live with his parents until the following July, where we bought a house for $9,850. He was working at United Airlines full-time. Besides, you'll be interested in this, that he went to night school for 14 years and got his degree at Northwestern. We live in Lake San Marcos. We've been married for 64 years. We have 3 children and 3 spouses, 10 grandchildren, and 12 great-grandchildren. I do have some stories to tell about some of my travels that you might be interested in if I have time. But thank you, you've been a very attentive audience.
I am Lee McMahon. As you just heard, I'm an imitation Rosie the Riveter because I never really got to touch a rivet. But I did help build airplanes, and I did help get women places where they hadn't been before. But let me, without going through everyone else that was here, those are common experiences and things I remember, but one of the things I remember most was sitting with my late first husband on a wall on a Sunday morning outside of the apartment where we lived in. It was in the front of that apartment there was a huge big house that was owned by a family that lived there for years. And suddenly the daughter of that household came screaming out of the door saying, "The Japs have bombed Pearl Harbor." Now, I could tell from the tone of her voice that that was not a good thing that had happened. But the first question that really came to my mind is, where the heck is Pearl Harbor? So we soon found out. It happened that she was so concerned because her husband was a military man and then stationed in the Presidio in San Francisco. And so she knew what Pearl Harbor was. And I could understand later, and of course even then, what it meant to us. But how did I get into an aircraft factory? Well, I graduated from high school in 1939. I was born in 1923. And I had no career plans because there seemed to be a limited number of job opportunities for women. There was, first of all, we didn't think of it as a job opportunity. We just thought of it as a natural occurrence. I think you're going to wind up being a wife and a mother. In the meantime, you could be a stenographer. That's wonderful, work in an office. I never could learn how to type. Still don't know how. Thank heavens for the word processor. But I didn't want to be a waitress. Just wasn't very good at that. I tried it when I was in college, but I wasn't good at it, and it didn't attract me as a career. I wasn't going to be a nurse. We had women nurses in those days. We didn't have male nurses, as a matter of fact. So discrimination, I guess it worked both ways. But I just not a good hands-on healer. So I really had no career plans. So when the war came and I was ill prepared to do anything, they put out a call for women to go to work in an aircraft factory, and happened to live in Santa Monica, or live in Topanga Canyon, which was near Santa Monica. And there was a Douglas aircraft plant there in Santa Monica. I had been back east for a while, and I came back to the West Coast, and I was being driven home to Topanga Canyon, and I looked and I thought, that's funny, I never noticed that hill over there as we were westbound in the Santa Monica area. I never noticed that hill before. Isn't that strange? All those little houses and things up there. Well, that was camouflage that they put on top of the Douglas plant so that it wouldn't look like a place that was worth bombing. It looked like a city. And of course, we weren't expecting cities to be picked on in those days, just things. Anyway, they had taken over what had been a women's club, I think, up along Wilshire Boulevard in Westwood Boulevard, Westwood City. And you went in at one end. Now they're looking for people to go to work at Douglas. You go in at one end. If you didn't have a Social Security card, the first stop was you get there and you get a Social Security card. Took care of that part. Then you went down the line and they asked you, you know, what could you do? I don't know, what do you want done? So they looked at some lists and said, okay, maybe you can be a material checker. Okay, I guess I could do that. Now so they give me a bunch of information about that and what I'm supposed to wear and when I'm supposed to report, which was the next day, and how I'm supposed to be garbed. But before that, I had to go to get my eyes examined. Now, you got our eyes examined in a very sophisticated way. One of those stereopticon things that they put in front of you, and they say, tell me when the goose gets in the gander, or whatever they're wanting to bring together. And so he pushed the thing, and the two things moved a little bit, but they never got together. And so this doctor said, I told you to tell me when they met. And I said, I know what you told me, and if they had met, I would have told you. So he said, let's try it again. He tried it again, and he got the same results. He said, well, let's see what you're supposed to do. Oh, you don't need depth perception to do that, he said. Okay. Away I went. So that's how I got hired. And I borrowed a pair of pants from my younger brother because I didn't have any pants to wear and I had to wear pants. I don't know where I got a snood. We had to wear a snood, which is a thing that went around your head to keep your hair out of the machinery. And I got a badge that said 225, 225 on it. That meant I was going to be employee number 225 in department 225. I can remember that clearly. And so the first time I reported to work, and there was a young man there. As a matter of fact, he happened to be somebody I had known when I was in high school, but that was irrelevant, really. His job was to teach me, or any incoming person to that department, how to read a micrometer. A micrometer is a little gadget that you wind up, holding it, the metal in between it, and it has 125 marks on it. Every time it goes around once, that's 0.25 hundredths of an inch, I think. And then if it went around 13 more times, then you had 25 and 38. So you would say, ah, this is 0.38 inches thick. Isn't that what you want? Yes, that's what you want. Okay, you can have this piece. And he said, well, let's try it again, like that was a fluke. I said, well, it's easy. Okay, so I got past. He was apparently prepared to spend a couple of nights teaching ladies, women, unskilled people, how to read a micrometer. So, but I got to work. Now we started in always on the last shift, the graveyard shift they called it, which is fine. It's just great. You didn't have to work as many hours. But every time you got promoted, they put you back and you started the day shift or the swing shift or something. So you kept rotating your time around, and I did get promoted. As a matter of fact, I started in doing this material dispensing, and they decided they needed a control unit for that department, so they asked me if I would be over there and keep records on what was coming into that department and when it went out, so people could come and see if it's there. Well, I did that. That was easy. And then somebody decided we have a problem because some things are not getting where they're supposed to get. So we want somebody in this general area to go find out where they are. Me. Nosy me. Well, I had found out that a lot of things went into what they called a burring department. This was staffed by ladies who had never been out of the kitchen before, I think, and who decided that, oh, I never did like to do this one. So they pick up this part that we were going to make airplanes out of if they did their job, and they would bury it under rags at their workplace and go get another job that they didn't dislike doing. And I soon found out, okay, let's go look under the rags and find the thing that they're waiting for because they're hollering down the line, and the worst thing that they could say was, if we don't get things, the line will stop. And we were building airplanes, the little airplanes, 200 to a batch. So, you know, they didn't really want to back up and have all those, the lines stop. So they would be alert, and then they'd come looking for it. The real expediters, as they called them, would do that. And I was getting very good at that. Well, anyhow, it was an interesting place to be because I'd never been in a factory. I never knew how they could make things flow and go. I'd always heard about the mass production that they had in the automobile industry in Detroit. And I thought, boy, they must have really known how to do it. So one of my life goals was to go to an automobile plant and see how they did it in a place where they really knew how. Well, I got to that later. I'm glad we didn't do it their way. The one thing that I did learn was to watch the contract number, the order number, when we were getting a new contract for 200 more airplanes. And I had observed that we ordered our engines from Dayton, Ohio or someplace. And at the same time they ordered those engines, they were supposed to order from the same place a motor mount. Now the motor mount did get something done to them after they arrived at Douglas, Santa Monica. We didn't mess with the engines, you understand. But the motor mounts we had to adjust so they would hang on our airplanes the right way. So it finally dawned on me that I bet you those people didn't order motor mounts, because here comes the new contract. I bet they just ordered motors. So I made it my business to go down to the ordering place and say, where did you order the motor mounts? Huh? So that was a major contribution I made because the line didn't stop. However, there was another problem. So they would get put on would move to us from back east on trains. Train space cargo space was very valuable and hard to get on. And I would leave work one night or morning, whatever shift I was on at the time, thinking, oh boy, the motor mounts have gotten priority and they're on their way. and I can relax and worry about something else, which of course I'm very good at doing that. But I stopped worrying too soon, because I'd come back the next day and my order of motor mounts had been out prioritied and dumped off the train in Wichita, Kansas, and I had to start all over again. However, it all worked out in the end. I didn't, as I say, touch anything. I did learn a lot. I did enjoy a lot. I think I contributed a lot. I did think they did find out that, give them a chance. Some of the women, let them go back to the kitchen. But some of them have something worth keeping out here in the real world, and it was a chance to help make that happen.